Sylvania didn't invent light. It invented light's afterglow in American memory. By the middle of the 20th century, a bulb bearing that name burned in nearly every American home. And by 1964, its engineers had cracked something no one else could. A red so true, so bright, that it changed the color of every American living room the moment the family gathered to watch television. 22,000 workers once carried that name to work across 7 states in a company built from nothing but a young man's habit of rescuing burned-out bulbs and giving them a second life. And then, without a single public collapse, without a bankruptcy headline, without a funeral anyone noticed, the American company itself was sold piece by piece, first to a Dutch conglomerate, then to a German one, until the hands holding the name were no longer American at all. How does a company that once colored the American living room simply disappear from American ownership, while its name keeps glowing on the shelf as if nothing had happened? The story begins in 1901 in the small town of Middleton, Massachusetts, where a young man named Frank A. Poor made a decision that seemed almost too modest to matter. Poor was 22 years old, ambitious in a quiet way, and he had noticed something the rest of the world had thrown away without a second thought: burned-out light bulbs. In an era when electric light was still a novelty in most American homes, a dead bulb was simply trash. Poor saw something else. He saw a business. He became a partner in a small operation that renewed those dead bulbs, giving them a second life at a fraction of the cost of a new one. It was unglamorous work. Dark filaments pried out with a tool not unlike a button hook, glass tips carefully sealed and resealed, each renewed bulb tested on a photometer in a darkroom to make sure it would still deliver light worth paying for. But Poor understood something that mattered more than the mechanics of the work. American households were electrifying fast, and not every family could afford to keep buying new bulbs every time one failed. There was room in that gap for a company that could make old light useful again. He soon moved the operation to Danvers, bought out his original partner, and named the new company Bay State Lamp Company. It was his alone now, and he ran it with a philosophy that would define the business for decades to come. Reinvest everything back into the company rather than pull profits out. His brothers, Edward and later Walter, joined him, and together they expanded beyond simply renewing old bulbs. By 1909, they had founded the high-grade incandescent lamp company to sell new carbon filament bulbs outright. And by 1911, they had moved into the newer, better tungsten filament technology that was starting to replace carbon across the industry. The ambition kept growing. In 1916, High Grade opened a new plant and headquarters in Salem, Massachusetts, built on the site of 2 burned-out tanneries, a fitting piece of ground for a company built on giving new life to things others had given up on. That Salem plant could turn out 16,000 light bulbs a day, a number that would have seemed unimaginable to the young man who started out with nothing but a screwdriver and a belief that broken things could still shine. What Frank Poor was building was never framed as a grand vision of American progress, not in the way later entrepreneurs would frame their companies. It was simpler than that, and perhaps more honest. Light was becoming essential to ordinary life, and someone needed to make sure ordinary families could afford to keep their homes lit. That belief, unglamorous, practical, deeply rooted in the economics of working-class America, would carry Poor's company through mergers, name changes, and a radio boom that none of the Poor brothers could have predicted when they first started retooling old bulbs by hand in Middleton. The company they built would soon collide with an entirely different invention taking over American homes. One that used no filament and no glass tip, but something far stranger: vacuum tubes and the birth of American radio. By the 1940s, Sylvania's name had crossed from an industrial curiosity into the language of everyday American life. And by the 1950s and into the 1960s, it had become something closer to a fixture of the American home itself. This is the era people remember, not because of quarterly earnings or expansion charts, but because of what the name meant standing in a hardware store aisle, or glowing from a hallway ceiling, or flickering to life inside a television cabinet in the corner of a living room. Picture a father in 1955 walking into a five-and-dime store, running his thumb along a row of boxed bulbs, choosing Sylvania not because of any advertisement he'd seen that week, but because the box felt familiar, dependable, already trusted by his own father before him. That kind of quiet loyalty, unremarkable, repeated in millions of homes, was the true foundation the company was built on. It wasn't flash. It was the light left on in the kitchen while a mother finished the dishes, the porch light that clicked on automatically as a teenager came home past curfew, the fluorescent tubes humming steadily above a father's workbench in the garage on a Saturday afternoon. But it was television that turned Sylvania from a trusted name into something closer to a household legend. In June of 1964, the company's engineers achieved something no one else in the industry had managed. A europium-based red phosphor for color television picture tubes, producing a red so vivid, so true to life, that it changed what American families believed a television screen could look like. Until that point, color television had always felt slightly off. Reds that leaned orange, skin tones that looked faintly wrong, colors that hinted at reality without ever quite arriving there. Sylvania's phosphor closed that gap. For the first time, a red rose on screen looked like an actual red rose. A woman's lipstick looked like lipstick, not a smudge of orange-tinted static. Families who could afford the leap into color television in the mid-1960s remember the specific moment of first power on. The low hum of the tube warming up, the picture blooming slowly from a pinprick of light into a full, saturated image. And then, almost always someone in the room saying some version of the same thing. Look how real that looks. Neighbors were invited over deliberately to witness it. Grandparents who had grown up with black and white radio dramas sat transfixed in front of a screen that suddenly, finally, matched the color of the world outside the window. For a growing American middle class in the 1960s, a Sylvania color television wasn't simply an appliance. It was proof that a family had arrived somewhere. And woven into all of it, quietly, almost invisibly, was the flash of a Sylvania flash cube on Christmas morning, at a birthday party, at a high school graduation. Before automatic flash existed inside cameras, families depended on these small mechanical bursts of chemical light. 4 bulbs arranged in a compact cube, each firing once, rotating automatically to the next after each shot. The sound is remembered almost as clearly as the light itself, a small mechanical click, then a sharp pop, then a burst of white that froze a single second of a family's life onto film forever. Grandmothers holding new grandchildren, fathers awkwardly posed beside first cars, teenagers rolling their eyes at yet another photograph. Every one of those frozen moments, for millions of American families, was lit by a Sylvania bulb they never thought twice about. Behind all of this, inside the plants themselves, workers in Danvers, Salem, and later Batavia and Smithfield experienced their own version of the golden era. Not glamorous, but stable, communal, and a source of genuine pride. To work at a Sylvania plant in the 1950s and 1960s was to belong to something larger than a paycheck. It meant working alongside neighbors, sometimes multiple generations of the same family clocking in at the same facility, manufacturing something that would end up, quite literally, illuminating someone else's home that same week. There was a tangible satisfaction in that kind of work. You could point to the glowing porch light down the street and know, with quiet certainty, that your hands had helped make it possible. By the mid-1960s, Sylvania's name sat inside garages, kitchens, living rooms, and family photo albums across the country in a way few companies ever achieve. It had become part of the texture of ordinary American life, not celebrated loudly but trusted deeply, generation after generation. What almost no one sitting in front of one of those glowing color television sets could have imagined, however, was that the very industry Sylvania had just helped perfect was about to become the industry that would first begin to slip out of its hands entirely. By the early 1930s, Frank Poor's company had already outgrown the simple picture of 3 brothers running a bulb renewal shop in Massachusetts. Growth, for Sylvania, did not come from a single bold decision made in a boardroom. It came from a deliberate strategy of merging strength with strength, stitching together separate companies that had each built expertise in a different corner of the same emerging industry. In 1931, that strategy reached its most important turning point. High-grade, based in Massachusetts, merged with Nilco and its subsidiary Sylvania Products Company, based in Pennsylvania, forming the high-grade Sylvania Corporation. For a few years, the company sold its light bulbs under the high-grade name and its radio tubes under the Sylvania name, as if still deciding which identity would define its future. That decision was made in 1942 when the company renamed itself Sylvania Electric Products and debuted a new symbol of its ambitions, a stylized flashing S, a logo built for a company that intended to be seen everywhere. The timing of that expansion could not have been more consequential. As the world moved toward war, the demand for electrical components exploded, and Sylvania was positioned exactly where that demand landed hardest. In the years just before Germany invaded France, the company's annual sales stood at roughly $8 million, a respectable, unremarkable figure for a mid-sized manufacturer. By 1945, at the peak of wartime production, that number had surged past $125 million. In less than a decade, Sylvania had grown more than 15 times over, driven by military contracts for radio components, vacuum tubes, and defense electronics that the country urgently needed. That kind of growth reshaped the company's physical footprint almost overnight. New plants opened across Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Employment, once measured in the dozens, now stretched into the thousands. Between June and October of 1933 alone, employment across the company's 4 plants had already jumped from roughly 2,500 workers to nearly 4,800, with weekly payroll growing at a similarly dramatic pace. By the time the post-war boom took hold, Sylvania was operating in 22 communities across 7 states, employing more than 22,000 people. An extraordinary transformation for a business that had started with 15 employees renewing burned-out bulbs by hand. The company's leadership understood that wartime demand alone would not sustain that scale forever. The real question, openly discussed inside the company at the time, was what would happen once peace returned. Would Sylvania shrink back down to its pre-war size, or find a way to hold on to the scale it had built? Rather than retreat, the company chose to expand further into peacetime markets, using its wartime engineering expertise to push into new categories entirely. In 1944, it acquired Colonial Radio Corporation of Buffalo, New York, which became the foundation of its radio and television division, a division that would soon manufacture home radios, television receivers, and automobile radios for a booming consumer market hungry for new technology. 2 years later, in 1946, the company folded in the Wabash Corporation, absorbing the Wabash Photo Flash and Bird's Eye Lamp businesses into what would become its lighting division. By the end of the 1940s, virtually everything the company made, light bulbs, radio tubes, television components, camera flash equipment, was merchandised under a single, unified name, Sylvania. This was not simply about efficiency. It was a calculated bet that a single trusted brand, stretched across many product categories, could carry more weight in the American consumer's mind than a portfolio of smaller, disconnected names ever could. For the employees swept up in this expansion, the experience was double-edged. For many, it meant real opportunity, stable jobs in new plants, upward mobility for skilled workers, a sense of being part of something growing larger every year. Communities like Danvers and Salem became defined in part by their relationship to the company. Multiple generations of the same family might work at the same facility, and a Sylvania paycheck was, for many households, a mark of security. But rapid expansion also brought new pressure. Quality control across a growing number of facilities became harder to guarantee uniformly. Corporate decision-making grew more distant from the shop floor. A company that had once been 3 brothers overseeing a single Danvers plant was now a sprawling, multi-state industrial operation, and the intimacy of those early years began, quietly, to fade. By 1959, the company's ambitions reached their natural conclusion. Sylvania merged with General Telephone, forming General Telephone and Electronics, later simply GTE. The merger gave Sylvania access to enormous capital and a parent company with interests far beyond light bulbs and radio tubes. It also, almost imperceptibly, planted the seed of a different kind of future, one in which lighting and consumer electronics were no longer the center of the company's identity, but merely one division among many inside a much larger telecommunications empire. Nobody buying a Sylvania television set in 1959 could have known it, but the company that made it now answered to a parent whose real ambitions were pointed somewhere else entirely. By the 1960s, Sylvania was no longer simply a manufacturer that Americans bought from out of habit. It had become something closer to a fixture of national identity, a name so deeply embedded in daily life that most people never stopped to consider how many different rooms of their lives it quietly occupied. The bulb in the hallway, the radio on the kitchen counter, the television in the living room, the flash cube in the camera bag packed for a family vacation. Few companies in American history had managed to become so thoroughly woven into the physical texture of ordinary life without ever becoming a subject of conversation in itself. Sylvania wasn't discussed. It was simply there, the way electricity itself was simply there. By this point, the company employed more than 22,000 people across 22 communities in 7 states, standing as one of only 4 companies in the entire world that dominated the global lighting industry alongside General Electric, Philips, and Germany's Osram. Each of those 4 companies held roughly a quarter of the global market, an equilibrium so stable that antitrust regulators would later cite it as a reason no single rival could simply absorb Sylvania outright. That kind of dominance rarely announces itself. It is only visible in hindsight once you understand just how many households depended on one of 4 companies for the light inside their homes. And Sylvania was one of them. The moment that captured this dominance most vividly arrived in June of 1964, when Sylvania's engineers introduced a europium-based red phosphor for color television picture tubes, a technical achievement that translated, for ordinary families, into something remarkably simple. For the first time, the red on their television screen actually looked red, not orange-tinted, not muted, real. Television networks were only just beginning to broadcast regularly in color, and the sets capable of rendering that color faithfully were still a genuine novelty in most neighborhoods. A family that owned a color television with a true, vivid picture had something worth showing off. And in thousands of living rooms across the country, that is exactly what happened. Neighbors were invited over. Chairs were rearranged to face the screen. Grandparents who remembered radio dramas broadcast over static-laden airwaves sat in stunned silence, watching colors on a screen that finally matched the world they already knew. That scene, a family gathered tightly around a glowing console, color washing over their faces for the first time, became one of the defining domestic images of 1960s America, repeated with only minor variations in living room after living room, city after city. It is difficult to overstate how significant that shared experience was. Television, still a relatively new medium, binding the country together in the post-war decades, had just taken a leap toward realism that made the images feel less like a broadcast and more like a window. Sylvania had built that window. For the people working inside Sylvania's plants during these years, this was a period of genuine pride, not merely a paycheck. Employees in Danvers, Salem, and the newer plants that had opened to meet post-war demand often described a distinct sense of participation in something larger than themselves. A worker soldering components onto a picture tube in a Massachusetts factory could walk past a neighbor's house that same evening and see through the window the very glow his hands had helped create. That kind of direct, visible connection between labor and result is rare in any era of manufacturing, and it gave the Sylvania workforce a stability and loyalty that many companies of the period struggled to match. What made Sylvania's reach so remarkable, though, was not simply its scale. It was its persistence across generations within the exact same households. A grandmother in 1940 bought high-grade Sylvania bulbs to light her kitchen. Her daughter in the 1950s bought Sylvania radio tubes for the family console radio. Her granddaughter in the 1960s sat cross-legged on the living room floor, transfixed by the vivid reds and blues glowing from a Sylvania color television set, while a Sylvania flash cube captured the moment on film for an album that would be pulled out decades later at holiday gatherings. Few brands managed to embed themselves this deeply into the passage of family time itself, not as a single purchase, but as a continuous thread running quietly through 3 generations of American domestic life. Geographically, too, Sylvania's reach extended far beyond any single region or demographic. It was not a coastal brand, or a brand tied to a particular class of consumer. It reached rural households buying bulbs from the local hardware store with the same steady presence as it reached suburban families purchasing their first color television on installment credit. It was, in the truest sense, a national brand, unifying rich and poor, rural and urban, young and old, under the quiet glow of the same lit rooms. And yet, even as families gathered around their television sets, marveling at reds that finally looked real, a different kind of shift was already stirring far outside those living rooms. One that had nothing to do with picture quality and everything to do with where and by whom televisions themselves would soon be built. In 1978, somewhere on the assembly floor of Sylvania's television plant in Batavia, New York, a line worker might have noticed something small but unsettling. The orders weren't quite what they used to be. Not a collapse, not layoffs, just a subtle softening, the kind of shift that doesn't make headlines but registers first in the people closest to the work, in shipment counts that arrived a little lighter than the season before, in shift schedules that no longer stretch quite as long as they once had. To the American consumer standing in a department store aisle that same year, none of this was visible. Sylvania televisions still sat proudly on display shelves, still carried the trusted name that had colored American living rooms for over a decade. A father buying a new set for his family that Christmas had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. He compared brands, checked the price tag, and walked out with a box under his arm, confident he'd made a sound, ordinary choice, the same choice his own father might have made a generation earlier. But behind the department store shelves, in engineering departments and corporate offices far removed from the customer's line of sight, a different story was unfolding. Throughout the 1970s, Japanese electronics manufacturers, Sony, Panasonic, and others, had been closing the technical gap with American television makers at a startling pace, and then surpassing it. Their sets were often cheaper to produce, increasingly reliable, and manufactured with a level of precision that American factories, burdened by higher labor costs and aging equipment, found difficult to match. What had once been considered a uniquely American technical achievement, color television itself, was rapidly becoming a global commodity, and the companies best positioned to make it cheaply and efficiently were no longer based in Massachusetts or New York. They were based in Tokyo and Osaka. This was the first crack, and it was not a crack in Sylvania's product. The televisions coming off the Batavia and Smithfield production lines were still well made, still carried forward the same phosphor technology that had made the brand famous. The crack was structural, sitting one level above the factory floor, in the economics of an entire industry shifting beneath the company's feet. Sylvania was, by this point, no longer an independent company charting its own course. It was a division of GTE, General Telephone and Electronics, a telecommunications conglomerate for which consumer electronics was only one piece of a much larger, more diversified business. And for a company like GTE, a consumer electronics division facing shrinking margins and rising foreign competition was not an emergency to be fought through. It was a line item to be evaluated. Inside GTE's corporate offices, the conversation that began quietly in the mid-1970s was not about how to out-engineer the Japanese manufacturers or how to modernize the aging Batavia and Smithfield plants to compete on cost. It was a more fundamental question, one that any diversified parent company eventually asks about a struggling division. Was this still a business worth being in at all? GTE's core identity was shifting toward telecommunications infrastructure, and the executives steering that shift increasingly viewed consumer electronics, televisions, radios, camera flashes, as a legacy business from an earlier era of the company's history, not a strategic priority for its future. This is where the dramatic irony of Sylvania's story becomes almost unbearable in hindsight. In 1978, a woman in Ohio might have unwrapped a brand new Sylvania color television on Christmas morning, gathering her children around it exactly as her own parents had gathered around theirs in 1964, believing she was participating in a tradition that would simply continue indefinitely. She had no way of knowing that the very corporation manufacturing that television had already begun, quietly weighing whether to remain in the television business at all. The viewer's experience of the brand in the corporation's internal calculus about the brand's future had, by this point, become almost entirely disconnected from one another. For the engineers and line workers who did sense the shift, there was little they could do about it from where they stood. A factory worker in Smithfield could not restructure GTE's capital allocation strategy. An engineer in Batavia, even one who understood precisely how much ground Japanese manufacturers had gained in efficiency and cost, had no seat at the table where decisions about the division's future were actually being made. The gap between the people who built Sylvania televisions and the people who decided whether Sylvania would continue building them had grown over decades of mergers and corporate restructuring into an unbridgeable distance. What made this first crack especially dangerous was its invisibility to the very people who loved the brand most. There was no public announcement, no dip in quality customers could point to, no scandal reported in the evening news. The crack existed entirely in boardrooms, in spreadsheets comparing labor costs across continents, in quiet conversations about strategic priorities that never once mentioned the family in Ohio unwrapping a television on Christmas morning. And that raises an uncomfortable question that would only become clear years later. How does a company that never lost the trust of its customers still manage to lose control of its own future? By the end of the 1970s, the question inside GTE's leadership was no longer whether Sylvania's television business faced serious competitive pressure. It clearly did. The question had shifted to something far more consequential, one that would be answered not with a plan to fight back, but with a decision to walk away entirely. The decision that would prove fatal to Sylvania's identity as an American electronics manufacturer was not made on a factory floor, and it was not made in response to any single crisis. It was made in the boardrooms of GTE sometime in the late 1970s and finalized in 1981 by executives who were, by every account, thinking rationally about the future of a very large and diversified corporation. Their reasoning was not reckless. It was, in the narrow logic of corporate strategy, almost unremarkable. And that is precisely what made it so consequential. GTE's leadership at the time was steering the company firmly toward telecommunications. The consumer electronics division, televisions, radios, the legacy of Frank Poor's original lighting business now folded into a sprawling conglomerate, no longer fit neatly into where the company's executives believed its future lay. Japanese manufacturers had already demonstrated they could produce televisions more cheaply and, in many cases, more reliably than aging American plants burdened by higher labor costs and outdated tooling. Rather than commit the capital needed to modernize Sylvania's television manufacturing to compete on those terms, GTE's leadership made a different calculation entirely. Sell the division, redirect the proceeds and attention toward telecommunications infrastructure, and let someone else inherit the challenge of competing in a television market that had fundamentally changed. In 1981, GTE sold Sylvania's consumer electronics business to North American Philips. On paper, it looked like an ordinary corporate divestiture. One division changing hands, a routine transaction buried in trade publications. For the people whose working lives were built around that division, it was nothing of the kind. What GTE's executives were thinking, in the rooms where this decision was actually finalized, was not about the family in Ohio who had trusted the Sylvania name for 3 generations, or the line workers in Batavia and Smithfield who had spent decades building that trust one on television at a time. They were thinking about balance sheets, about where GTE's capital could generate the strongest returns going forward, about a telecommunications industry on the edge of transformation that would, within another decade, demand enormous new investment. Consumer electronics in that calculation was a legacy cost center, valuable once, but no longer central to what the corporation believed itself to be. For the workers on the front lines, the sale arrived less as a single dramatic event and more as a slow, disorienting realization. Engineers who had spent careers refining Sylvania's picture tube technology now found themselves, overnight, employees of Philips, a company with its own engineering culture, its own priorities, and crucially, its own brand ambitions. Line workers who had built their identities around the Sylvania name, who had watched their own televisions glow in their own living rooms with quiet pride, now worked for a corporation that had acquired their plants, but had very different plans for what would come out of them. The clearest sign of how thoroughly Sylvania's fate had passed out of American hands came almost immediately after the sale closed. Philips, it turned out, already owned Philco, a rival American television brand it had acquired years earlier. And Philco's own trademark agreements made it legally impossible for Philips to keep selling televisions under both names in the United States market. Something had to give. Executives inside Philips weighed the two names against each other, not based on decades of customer loyalty, not based on the trust that three generations of American families had placed in one name over the other, but based on a narrower question of trademark rights and brand strategy within Philips's own global portfolio. The decision, when it came, was quiet and administrative. Sylvania's name would step aside. Philco would remain. For the people who had spent their careers building Sylvania's reputation, for the engineer in Batavia who had helped refine the very phosphor technology that made Sylvania televisions famous, for the line supervisor in Smithfield who had trained a decade of new hires under that name, this was the moment it became unmistakably clear that the company's fate now belonged to people who had never watched a Sylvania set glow to life in their own living room. Sylvania hadn't lost the argument on merit. It had lost it in a legal filing, decided by an ownership structure that had nothing to do with the brand's history and everything to do with which trademark happened to be more convenient to preserve. This marked the end of Sylvania television production in the United States. The Batavia plant, once a hub of picture tube innovation, and the Smithfield plant in North Carolina, once humming with the same pride that had defined Sylvania's golden decades, would no longer produce televisions bearing the name that had built them. Smithfield's facility would later be repurposed under an entirely different name, Channel Master, a fitting, almost poetic detail, since the very channels Sylvania had once helped bring into vivid color would now be managed by equipment made under a name that had nothing to do with the company that started it all. And still, this was only half of what would ultimately unravel. Sylvania's lighting business, the original heart of the company, the bulbs that Frank Poor's brothers had once hand-renewed in a small Massachusetts workshop, continued on for another decade under GTE's ownership, seemingly stable, seemingly secure. But by the early 1990s, GTE faced a new and even larger strategic reckoning. The emerging mobile telecommunications industry required enormous capital investment to compete, and GTE's leadership concluded that funding this new frontier meant finding capital elsewhere in the company's holdings. The lighting division, Sylvania's oldest and most original business, the one that had started it all in 1901, was once again viewed not as an irreplaceable legacy, but as a source of capital to be unlocked. By this point, the global lighting industry was dominated by only four companies: Sylvania, General Electric, Philips, and Germany's Osram, each holding roughly a quarter of the world market. International antitrust regulations made it impossible for any single one of those three rivals to acquire Sylvania's business outright without upsetting that delicate balance. So a different kind of deal was struck instead, one that split the company geographically. Osram GmbH would acquire the Sylvania brand and its lighting business across North America, Mexico, and Puerto Rico. Everywhere else in the world, Europe, Asia, Latin America, would be spun off through a management buyout, forming an entirely separate entity that would eventually become known as SLI, Sylvania Lighting International. In January of 1993, this transaction was finalized, and Osram Sylvania was born as the North American arm of a German lighting conglomerate. The name Sylvania would continue to appear on bulb packaging in American hardware stores for decades to come. Familiar, trusted, seemingly unchanged. But the company behind that name, the one Frank Poor had built from nothing beginning in 1901, no longer existed as an independent American enterprise. It had been divided, sold, and absorbed into foreign ownership structures 12 years after its television business had already suffered the same fate. Nobody who picked up a box of Sylvania bulbs at a hardware store in 1993 would have noticed anything different. The packaging looked the same. The flashing S logo, largely unchanged since 1942, still sat in the corner. And that, in the end, is what made this collapse so different from the collapses of other American brands. There was no single dramatic headline, no bankruptcy filing splashed across newspapers, no store liquidation with crowds picking through discounted merchandise. The company simply stopped being American. quietly, administratively, one signed agreement at a time. Who exactly is supposed to notice when a piece of American industrial history disappears not through failure, but through boardroom decisions engineered specifically so that no one would notice at all? By 1993, both halves of what Frank Poor had built, the electronics division sold to Philips in 1981, and now the lighting division split between Osram and a European buyout, had passed entirely out of American corporate hands. All that remained was the name, still glowing quietly on store shelves across the country, attached now to companies that had never known Frank Poor, never walked the floor of the original Danvers plant, and had no particular reason to remember why the name had once meant something at all. If Sylvania's fall had to be marked by a single public moment, it would not be a bankruptcy announcement or a dramatic evening news segment. It would be smaller than that and far quieter. A trade publication notice in 1981 confirming that GTE had completed the sale of its consumer electronics division to North American Philips. No press conference captured the moment. No customer standing in a department store that week would have seen a headline warning them that the television on the shelf in front of them was, for all practical purposes, the last generation to carry the Sylvania name in full ownership by an American parent. The collapse of Sylvania did not arrive as a single blow. It arrived as a sequence of transactions, each one legal, orderly, and almost entirely invisible to the public that had trusted the name for decades. The timeline, once you step back from it, is startling in its brevity. In barely 12 years, from the 1981 sale of the television and electronics division to Philips, to the 1993 sale of the North American lighting business to Osram, the entire American company that Frank Poor had spent a lifetime building was dismantled and redistributed to foreign ownership. 12 years is not a long time in the life of a company that had already existed for 80. And within that narrow window, the unraveling did not happen all at once. It happened in two distinct waves, each one severing a different piece of what Sylvania had once been. The first wave hit the people inside the Batavia and Smithfield plants directly. For the engineers who had spent their careers refining Sylvania's picture tube technology, the sale to Philips did not simply mean a new logo on their paychecks. It meant watching a company culture they had helped build get absorbed into someone else's priorities, someone else's product roadmap, someone else's brand strategy. When the trademark conflict with Philco was resolved in Philco's favor, the announcement inside the plant would have landed not as breaking news, but as confirmation of something many employees had likely feared since the day ownership changed hands. The name on their paycheck no longer mattered, not even to the company now signing it. Television production under the Sylvania name in the United States ended, and with it, the specific expertise, culture, and pride that had defined those factory floors for over a generation quietly dispersed. For the workers themselves, there was no single dramatic day of mass layoffs captured by television cameras, no crowd of employees walking out of a shuttered plant for the cameras to film. The transition unfolded more gradually and more bureaucratically than that, the way most large corporate divestitures do: reassignments, restructurings, product lines discontinued in stages rather than all at once. But the effect on the ground was the same regardless of how quietly it happened. The Smithfield, North Carolina plant, once a source of steady employment and community identity, would eventually be repurposed entirely under a different name, Channel Master, severing the physical link between that facility and the Sylvania name forever. Batavia's television manufacturing wound down as well, another quiet casualty of a corporate decision made hundreds of miles away by executives who had never worked a shift on either factory floor. For customers, the experience of loss was murkier still, and in some ways more unsettling for how little of it they could actually see. There was no single day when Sylvania televisions vanished from store shelves. Instead, over the years following the 1981 sale, the sets available under the Sylvania name gradually became something different, manufactured under Philips's direction, carrying Philips's engineering priorities, no longer connected to the same research and production lineage that had produced the celebrated color technology of 1964. A family walking into an electronics store in the mid-1980s looking for a Sylvania television, the same brand their parents had trusted a generation earlier, would have had no way of knowing that the company actually manufacturing the product they were about to buy bore almost no institutional relationship to the one that had built the name's reputation in the first place. The trust remained. The company that had earned it did not. The second wave of the collapse, arriving over a decade later in 1993, unfolded with the same quiet, procedural character as the first, but this time it struck at the very origin of the company itself, the lighting business that Frank Poor had built from nothing in 1901. GTE's decision to sell its North American lighting operations to Osram was driven by an entirely different pressure than the one that had pushed the television division out the door 12 years earlier. This time, the reasoning was about the future rather than the past. The emerging mobile telecommunications industry demanded enormous new capital investment, and GTE's leadership determined that funding that future meant releasing its hold on a business that, however storied, no longer aligned with where the company believed its identity was headed. There was, again, no single dramatic closing day for the public to witness. No liquidation sale drew crowds into stores searching for discounted merchandise. No anchor store departure left a shopping mall visibly hollowed out overnight, the way it might for a department store chain. Sylvania's lighting business did not fail in the marketplace. Sylvania bulbs, in fact, continued selling briskly, continued lighting American homes exactly as they always had. What ended was not the product's popularity. What ended was the product's American ownership. The transaction that split the company between Osram in North America and a separate management buyout everywhere else in the world was negotiated in corporate offices, finalized on paper, and absorbed by the public with barely a ripple because, from the outside, almost nothing appeared to change. The boxes on hardware store shelves still said Sylvania. The flashing S logo, largely unaltered since 1942, still sat in the corner exactly where it always had. This is precisely what made the collapse of Sylvania so different from the collapses that defined so many other forgotten American brands. There was no liquidation sale, no dramatic final day, no crowd of mourning customers filling a parking lot to say goodbye to a familiar storefront. The name simply kept glowing, kept selling, kept lighting American homes, while the company standing behind it changed hands, it changed nationalities, and changed priorities almost entirely out of public view. For the workers whose careers had been built inside Sylvania's original plants, and for the engineers who had once raced to perfect a shade of red no other company on earth could reproduce, the ending arrived not as a single wound, but as a slow realization, spread out over more than a decade, that the company they had given their working lives to no longer existed in any form they would have recognized. By the time the last of Frank Poor's original company had been fully absorbed into foreign ownership in 1993, 92 years had passed since a 22-year-old had first started renewing dead light bulbs by hand in a small Massachusetts workshop. 92 years of American manufacturing history, American innovation, and American household trust had ended, not with a headline, but with a signature on a transaction that most of the country never even noticed had occurred. What does it mean when a company can disappear so completely and so quietly that its own customers never even learn to grieve it? In the years that followed, the void Sylvania left behind was filled not by a single dramatic competitor, but by an entire shift in where American consumer electronics and lighting were manufactured. Japanese companies like Sony and Panasonic, and later Korean manufacturers, absorbed the television market that Sylvania had once helped define, building on the very technical advantages that had made Sylvania's American factories uncompetitive in the first place. In lighting, the story was subtler but no less significant. The Sylvania name itself survived, but as a product line inside a much larger, foreign-owned lighting conglomerate, competing not as an independent innovator, but as one brand among several inside Osram's global portfolio. There was no dramatic revival attempt in the way some forgotten brands eventually see a nostalgic relaunch or a licensed comeback aimed at collectors. Sylvania never disappeared from shelves long enough to require one. Instead, the brand simply kept evolving under its new owners, drifting further from its origins with each subsequent transaction. In 2016, Osram spun off its general lighting business into a new independent company called Ledvance, which took over the Sylvania brand in North America. A year later, in 2017, Ledvance itself was sold to a consortium of Chinese investors and lighting companies. Meanwhile, the international rights to the Sylvania name outside North America had already passed through yet another set of hands, acquired in 2007 by the Indian company Havells, and then in 2016 sold again to a Chinese conglomerate, forming what is known today as Philo Sylvania. The name that Frank Poor built in a small Massachusetts workshop now belonged, in different corners of the world, to Chinese and Indian-linked ownership structures that had no historical connection to the company's American origins whatsoever. The broader lesson embedded in Sylvania's story is one that runs quietly beneath the surface of American consumer culture in the second half of the 20th century. A brand's survival on store shelves is not the same thing as a company's survival as an institution. Sylvania bulbs are still sold in American hardware stores today, still trusted by customers who have no reason to know the complicated ownership history behind the name on the box. But the company that earned that trust, the one built by a family of brothers in Danvers, expanded through wartime production and celebrated for perfecting the color red on American television screens, stopped existing as an independent American entity decades ago. What Sylvania's story reveals is that a name can outlive the company that built it by generations, becoming a kind of orphaned trust, still honored by consumers, still profitable for its owners, but disconnected entirely from the people, culture, and place that originally earned it. For the communities that had once depended on Sylvania's presence, the impact was felt unevenly and often invisibly to outsiders. Danvers and Salem, Massachusetts, the towns where Frank Poor's original operations had taken root, gradually lost their direct manufacturing ties to the company as production shifted, consolidated, and eventually moved overseas entirely. Batavia, New York, and Smithfield, North Carolina, the towns that had once built Sylvania televisions, watched their local plants repurposed or shuttered as the electronics industry moved permanently beyond American shores. These were not sudden headline-grabbing losses. They were slow subtractions from local economies. Fewer shifts, fewer new hires, fewer reasons for a young person graduating high school to expect a stable manufacturing career waiting for them in their hometown. What then do we lose when a name endures, but the company behind it disappears entirely? Perhaps it is something harder to quantify than jobs or factories, though those losses were real enough for the families who depended on them. Perhaps what disappears is a kind of accountability, the sense that a name on a product carries with it a history, a place, a set of people who built something and stood behind it. When Sylvania's name kept glowing on store shelves long after the company itself had been sold, split, and resold across continents, it left American consumers holding on to a trust that had, quietly and legally, been transferred to owners who had never earned it in the first place. Orchestrated prose composition with tonal consistency and structural constraints. Orchestrated prose composition with tonal consistency and structural constraints. Somewhere tonight, in a garage in Massachusetts or a living room in Ohio, a hand reaches up to change a bulb, and without thinking twice picks up a box that says Sylvania. The flashing S still sits in the corner of the packaging, largely unchanged since 1942. A small emblem of a promise made generations ago by three brothers in Danvers who believed that ordinary families deserved reliable light at a price they could afford. Somewhere else, an older man tells his grandson about the Christmas morning in 1964, when his own family gathered around a new color television, watching a red rose on screen look, for the first time in his life, like an actual red rose. The boy will never understand why that moment mattered so much. He has never known a world where color on a screen could feel like a miracle. But he listens anyway because something in his grandfather's voice tells him this was real, and it was American, and it mattered. There was a specific kind of American household that Sylvania helped build quietly over the better part of a century. It was not a household defined by luxury or ambition, but by steadiness. The porch light left on for a teenager coming home past curfew. The fluorescent tubes humming above a father's workbench on a Saturday afternoon. The flash cube's small mechanical click and sudden burst of white freezing. A birthday, a graduation, a new grandchild onto film that would outlast the moment itself by decades. Sylvania was never the brand people talked about at dinner parties. It was the brand that made dinner parties possible to remember afterward, captured in photographs lit by a small cube of chemical flame that no one thought twice about at the time. What made Sylvania matter in the end was never really about lighting or television technology at all. It was about the particular kind of trust that develops between a family and a name, repeated across generations without interruption. A trust so quiet it becomes invisible, so consistent it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like simply the way things are. A grandmother bought high-grade Sylvania bulbs to light her kitchen in the 1940s. Her daughter bought Sylvania radio tubes for the family console a decade later. Her granddaughter sat transfixed by a Sylvania color television in the 1960s, a moment captured forever by a Sylvania flash cube. 3 generations, one continuous thread of light, running quietly through the most ordinary rooms of American domestic life. That kind of continuity is rare, and it is easy to take for granted precisely because it never announced itself. It simply endured year after year, bulb after bulb, until it didn't. What Sylvania represented, and what its story ultimately reveals, is how much of American industrial life was built not on singular acts of genius, but on the accumulated weight of ordinary reliability. A company that never needed to be exceptional in any given year, only dependable across many of them. The tragedy of its ending is not that Sylvania failed to innovate or failed to earn the loyalty it received. It is that the very reliability the company built over 90 years made its eventual dismantling almost impossible for its own customers to notice. There was no dramatic closing day, no crowd gathered to mourn a shuttered storefront, because the name never stopped glowing on the shelf. The company simply changed hands, quietly, methodically, until the people who once built it were gone, and the name belonged to owners who had never walked the floor of the original Danvers plant, never felt the particular pride of watching a neighbor's porch light glow with a bulb their own hands had helped make. Frank Poor started with nothing but a belief that broken things could still shine, and a willingness to do the unglamorous work of proving it. That belief carried a family business through world wars, mergers, and decades of expansion, until it became, briefly, one of the great illuminators of American domestic life. The engineers who perfected a red no one else could reproduce, the line workers in Danvers and Salem and Batavia, and Smithfield who built that light with their own hands, the families who trusted the name without ever needing to think about it twice. All of them deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in a corporate history, but as the true authors of what Sylvania actually meant. The company Frank Poor built no longer exists as he built it, but the light does. It is still there, in kitchens and garages and hallways across the country, glowing quietly from a name that has outlived the hands that made it matter. That in its own way is a kind of American story worth telling all the way to the end.